Welcome to the Townsend Center. I'm Rebecca Egger. I'm the executive director of the center, and we are very pleased to host Fiona McFarlane, who is an associate professor in the Department of English and director of the Creative Writing Minor, and Beth Piatote, associate professor of English and Comparative Literature and director of the Arts Research Center. They will discuss Fiona's award-winning collection of short stories, Highway 13. And before we get started, I wanted to mention a few upcoming events. Next Wednesday, we'll be hosting a book chat with Mark Goebel of the English department for a discussion of his book entitled Downtime, the 20th Century in Slow Motion. And the following day, Thursday, October 30th, we are very excited to be hosting a panel discussion inspired by this amazing art exhibit that we have up on the topic of Michel Foucault's work on the history of madness. And the panel will feature the artist himself, Patrick Chambon, as well as James Porter from the Department of Rhetoric and Lynn Huffer from Emory University. So we hope you can join us for those upcoming events. And Fiona and Beth, I'll turn it over to you. We're really happy to host you and looking forward to your conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to the Townsend Center and also to Fiona and to everybody who's here today. It's such a joy to be in conversation with Fiona about Highway 13, a profound, absorbing, and beautifully wrought collection of interlinked stories. I want to begin by giving a brief description of the book, then inviting Fiona to read an excerpt to start our conversation. I have a few questions to ask, and then I'll open up our conversation to the floor, so get ready. The central chord that connects the stories of Highway 13 is a discrete event located in a specific time and place. The murder of a dozen or so victims by a serial killer along a highway that cuts through a wooded park in Barrow, Australia from 1990 to 1997. The killer, a Barrow local named Paul Biga, is eventually captured and convicted, then incarcerated until his death in prison in 2020. This single episode has multitudinous effects. The 12 stories of the collection explore the long temporal, geographic, and emotional reverberations of that period of time when the identity of Barrow, recast as Murder Town, and Highway 13 became indelibly seared by and scarred by the acts of a single serial killer. The epigraph of the book comes from Shakespeare. Each substance of grief hath 20 shadows, from Richard II. Indeed, each story is carefully wrought exploration of the multitude of shadows cast by loss, in which the overly implotted narrative of the crime thriller, the monster, the terror in the woods, the killer on the highway, comes up against the ordinary and unpredictable modes of grief of people whose lives were shaped by Paul Biga's crimes, from an awkward office worker to the British brother of a victim to a retired police officer and a famous actor who climbs into a fat suit and deep into his own psyche to play the role of Biga in a true crime movie. Part of the brilliance of the book is that it refuses the spectacle of the origin story. Paul Biga is himself a shadow, and his crimes are present not as they existed for him, but as they live on in the long afterwards. Each story set over 78 years between 1950 and 2028, so going into the future, in locations from Barrow to Rome to Texas and elsewhere, brings us immediately into the lives of complex, aching, and wry characters, revealing insights about grief, love, and the stories that shape our lives. It's no surprise that this book immediately claimed a number of international prizes following its release in 2024. Highway 13 was named the winner of the Story Prize and the Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Fiction and shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Literary Award, the ABIA Literary Fiction Book of the Year, and the Ned Kelly Award for Best Crime Fiction. It was named a New Yorker Recommended Read of the Year among many other accolades. The Los Angeles Times reviewer Marianne Gwynn writes, McFarlane is a master at just about everything. Dialogue, setting, y'all know this. We've been with her all term. Dialogue, setting, comic timing. But her biggest accomplishment is creating an empathic bond with people whose lives are touched by unexplainable violence. McFarlane sets them off on journeys that are compulsively suspenseful and enormously readable. So with that, I invite you to share a few pages of your work with us.
Thank you so much, Beth. Thank you for agreeing to be in conversation with me. And thank you so much to all of you who have come, including my students who sort of had to because I I dragged them from class, but it could have filtered away as we walked over here and they haven't, so I appreciate that. I am going to read from the very first story, which is called Tourists. I'm not starting at the beginning. So just to give you a sense, this story is about a young man who works in an office. He's from Barrow, the town that the serial killer was living in, and he has a neighbor of his who also works in his office, and he tries to avoid often. She's sort of quite awkward in various ways, and one day she needs a ride home from work, and he offers to give it to her. So they're driving home through the forest in which the murders took place, but this is after the murders have already taken place. So they're in the car when we start. They were now entirely enclosed in the white-green light of the eucalypts. On their right, there were still flashes of sun where paddocks had been cleared close to the forest's edge, but on their left, the bush lay in thick, bright shade. "Have you been in?" asked Lena, gesturing at the forest. My Australian accent might get a bit broad on the dialogue, just letting you know. "Oh, all the time as a kid." "You grew up here," she said, not asking a question so much as stating an agreeable fact. "And what about since, since what?" There were any number of events in Joe's life that might qualify. Losing his virginity in Barrow State Forest, as it happened, on a Friday afternoon with Philippa Kremp in their sports uniforms. He was chewing gum and, lost to himself, swallowed it. Leaving for uni, moving to London, his mother dying, moving back from London, his father dying. But he knew what Lena meant, since everyone found out that a serial killer was burying bodies in the forest. "Not for years," said Joe. "I wondered Lena. "Could we go in there?" "Into the forest, I suppose so, if you like, sometime." Did he mean it? He didn't think he meant it. "Why not now?" She turned in her seat to face him. From the corner of his eye, he saw the white of her shirt and the yellow of her skirt and thought, a cracked egg. Then tried to unthink it. "I know everything there is to know about the murders," Lena said. "I've read all the books." Joe looked with pronounced attention at the road ahead. "I've never been brave enough to go in there alone, but I know just where I want to look." So she was a tourist. Joe's dad used to call them that in the days after the arrest. All the people who drove to Barrow, rolled through the streets, asked for directions at the post office and the petrol station, cruising through Murder Town. "What are you looking for?" he asked. "Just around this corner there's a fire trail. Do you know it?" Of course he knew it. Fire trails were for teenagers, bored, bursting, smoking, fucking, spooking each other, showing off. Philippa Crimp lifting her green jersey over her head and handing it to him as if he'd understand what to do with it. God, what a golden mystery. She was married now and lived in Perth. "Here, stop here," said Lena, and Joe did, pulling over beside the entrance to the fire trail. He'd been startled into compliance, but there was also something in the mottled light that had the feel of adolescence, of being young and horny, and of wanting to prove to a girl that he wasn't frightened. Which was too simple a way of putting it, failing to account for the heavy burden of those teenage days, the demand for proof that the world wasn't terrible, he wasn't terrible, his parents weren't terrible, that there was no such thing as terror. Yet evidently there was and had to be, in order that life might be vast enough to include Philippa Kremp, who grunted gently on the forest floor, who bit her lip, who said afterwards, "I knew you'd be nice about it," and hadn't swallowed her gum. Now Lena Derwent was flowing in her yellow from the car. She was plunging into the forest. It was simply a Thursday, and here he was, following her into the trees. He thought he should try to stop her, except that he didn't know what she was doing. "Lena," he called half-heartedly. She turned to him, raised one hand to her ear, and said, "Do you hear it?" "Hear what?" "Listen." Joe listened and heard the beat of insects, a clear high bird, cars on the highway. "What am I listening for?" Lena shook her head, smiled fondly, turned away, and continued down the fire trail. "Look out for snakes," he said, which was what they'd said as teenagers. You conjured a snake by warning against it. Reliably, the girls would press close and squeal, and Adam and Eve would stumble with their ciggies through the garden. The snake yawned and smiled, the fruit hung low, oh, in the surging warning of the world. Leda didn't stop or speak or acknowledge the warning in any way.
Oh, thank you. That's such a beautiful excerpt because it captures the voice and the humor and the terror and the layers of stories that we see threaded through the whole book. So let's just start with the obvious. This book is perfection. Obviously, the juries have determined that, so this observation is not original. But I just want to say a bit why I admire it so much. I was absolutely consumed as I read it, just the whole thing in one weekend, but in that obsessive way where you're just like binging and then you get like 2/3 of the way through and you're like, oh, I'm going to slow down so I can savor it to the end. And so it's just the writing is so incredible. And I'm going to say more about that in a minute. But first, I want to talk about the structure and the forms in the book. So the conceit of the book is brilliant. A lot of really excellent collections of short stories can have a very loose structure of relationship. Sometimes the stories are related by a shared setting, like a town or a common problem, but sometimes the only thing that the stories have in common is the author, and that's fine. A collection like that can be successful, but also as much as I love short stories, I've walked away from collections like that. Alternatively, you have collections that the stories are so interconnected that the book can pass for a novel. In collections like that, you have characters meeting up at some point or showing up in each other's stories. And Highway 13 strikes a balance between those two modes. It has a central organizing conceit, but every story is its own world with a diversity of narrative voices and story structures. The reader knows going into each story that somehow this story is going to link up with the central tragedy, and that creates tension. So there's this pursuit of that puzzle. And there are these images that recur across the stories, glimpses of ordinary objects, a taxi, an arm reaching, a telephone, birds. But each story also goes into deeper layers beyond that touchstone. So there's this, oh, and then, oh. And it's just an enormously satisfying experience. So my first question is, how did you come up with this concept for the book? And then how did the stories come out of that concept?
Thank you for saying such nice things about the book. I appreciate it. I came up with the idea for this book because I found myself during the pandemic in particular. I'd just moved to California. I didn't really know anyone, and suddenly I was in lockdown for 18 months in my house. And I started listening to a lot of true crime podcasts. And I got really interested in it as a form of storytelling. Particularly, I suppose because I was binge listening to these things, I started noticing the ways in which the podcasts were getting more and more interested in the ethics of the kind of storytelling they were doing, and questions around turning murder into entertainment or sensationalizing murder in order to create a narrative, and what it meant to tell a satisfying story about a terrible thing that had truly happened to people were all questions that were sort of circulating in my mind. And I had actually already started writing a short story that was about this, and it's the story that I just read from. It was the first story that I wrote, where I was interested in that moment of afterwards, that feeling of what happens to a place and what happens to a people once they've become associated with something that's so terrible. And any Australian reader of this book knows who the serial killer that I invented is based on. And he is someone who is huge in the cultural imagination. He's sort of our Ted Bundy, for those of you who are true crime listeners in the US. And so I got interested not so much in him and his psychology. I don't want to hear from him. I don't want him to speak. I don't care how he feels. What I care about is the the experience that other people have around the fact of his existence. And not just the people who are really, really closely affected by it, but also the people who are telling stories or sharing stories about it years later, or the podcast hosts who are, because so one of the stories in the collection is the transcript of a podcast episode, because that's where this sort of started. And so I was writing this story just about two people who go and visit the forest in which this stuff happened, and writing it, wondering to myself, well, how do I make this dramatic when the point here is not that a murder takes place or that something horrifying happens. The point is that this is a place in which something horrible happened, but it is also just a place like any other. And realized as I wrote that story that I had more to say than just this one story could do, and that I wanted to think about this not as just one response, but almost like a constellation of responses around one vacancy that I was just really deliberately not going near, because I'm interested in how you might write a collection of short stories about serial murder in which the murderer never appears and never has a chance to be romanticized or glamorized.
Oh, amazing. So one of the dynamics that this book reveals is the struggle to narrate one, as you just described, to narrate one's own experience or to experience one's own emotions against the overdetermined scripts that are written through the sensational crime story. And your characters struggle with the sort of external ordering of emotion. One story that displays this problem beautifully is Demolition, which is set in 2003 after Biga has gone to prison and the house in which he lived in is torn down. And the story is told through the perspective of his neighbor, Eva, an older woman who has lived next to this house since she was a child, so long before he was ever there. And the story splices sort of this script of how she should feel, this satisfaction or gleeful vengeance or something like that. And that's provided by a crime writer who shows up to talk to her about it. And that narrative is spliced in with Eva's own memories of childhood and what she has to let go of as she's watching those walls come down. So I realize I didn't put a question at the end of this. So I'm just going to go to my next thing, which is related, which is the expansion of this. So this work explores the long and unexpected reach of a violent event. And one of the ways this is expressed is in the story Abroad, which offers the line, "The dead are abroad, traveling everywhere," as a British expatriate navigates Halloween night in a chaotic Texas neighborhood. So 3 continents are drawn together in this story, demonstrating the geographic and emotional reach of loss. That story centers on the brother of a disappeared woman who is 1 degree removed, but you also have stories at a greater remove, such as The Wake, which takes the perspective of the partner of the investigator who cracked the case, and the ways that Ivy experiences the silences in Joan's life because of her work on this case. So how do you discover ways into these characters and use sort of like techniques like perspective to chart certain ways to capture the waves of remove from the event?
I wish there were a simple answer. I could say this is how I mathematically set out to do it, and these are the steps I took, and this is what I ended up with. Once I realized I was writing this book and that I needed multiple ways in, or not in, multiple ways into the space around this thing I wasn't planning to ever depict, I started to panic about how many, with exactly who should get to speak in the book and where they should be coming from. And I made decisions about not hearing really directly from a victim or from anything that's too close, because my interest is in the way stories about this are transmitted and the way in which the stories are told, less than in about the events themselves. And once I had made that decision, I went through the world in a way that I think most writers will appreciate, kind of in a state of sort of porosity, where everything I encountered became a possibility. And every time I met someone, they had no idea that I was thinking about how they or some aspect of them might fit into a short story collection about a serial killer in 1990s Australia. Uh, and often the characters in the stories arrived in that way. And once they had arrived, I'll give one example. So there's a story in here that is told from the point of view of a retired flight attendant who moves to a town in northern tropical Australia when he's retired. And that story exists because I was flying from Perth to Sydney. It's a 5-hour flight. It was a red eye, and there was in the seat behind me a retired flight attendant who talked the entirety of the 5-hour flight through the night about his retirement in a small northern Australian
Wow.
tropical town. He's not, that's the only way in which he appears in this book. It's not that at all. But of course I started taking notes. If you talk loudly in a public place, that will happen. And started thinking about how this might work. You know, the sentences started to happen to me, which is a thing that happens to writers. And I started thinking about, how do I want him to connect? And the more panicked I got about that, there's a lot of panic involved in writing, as writers also know. The more I realized I needed to relax about it, that what I needed to do is actually just get to know him and think about his story as its own narrative arc. That one of the things I wanted to do with this book is not think of the killer as the protagonist, but each of the characters in each of the stories are the protagonists of their own lives. And that's one of the ethical problems around true crime storytelling, and that sense of how we tell victim-centered stories around crime, because people's lives become organized by this narrative that they have been forced to participate in. That's the worst thing that's ever happened to them. So I told myself to relax about that and just to think about who is this guy, this retired flight attendant, and why, who does he know, and what does he want, and what state is he in his life when he moves to this little town, and what does he find when he gets there? And it was through doing that that the connection to Bega came through, rather than planning it in advance. Whereas there are other stories that felt like I always knew that I wanted to write a short story from the point of view of a politician who has the same surname as the killer, and he is
Such a good one.
He's up for election immediately after they arrest the killer, and so he's got all his like electoral paraphernalia, and it all has Bega on it, but Bega has just been arrested. And so that one I knew the way in that one. And maybe that's why that's the shortest story in the book, and it's all told in one sentence. So it's this one kind of breathless experience set over the course of him burning a sausage on a barbecue. And maybe that's partly why that his involvement with the murder was predetermined, and so I could just go straight to it. Whereas with the other ones, sometimes I found my way there, but I had to let the stories do that for me.
Yeah, I think that one of the effects that you see, because people are living their own lives, is they're insisting on other memories and other desires. There's so much desire and sexual desire and all kinds of just fullness of life in these stories, I think because of that approach. And it's just incredible to read. Well, I actually wanted to ask you to read a second excerpt.
Oh, sure.
Do you want to bring us another?
Yeah, maybe I'll read a little bit about the retired flight attendant. Okay, this story is called Hostess, and it is set in 1986. Well, the narrator is not speaking from 1986, but he's talking about the 80s. I met Jill in 1982. We were working the Sydney to LA route, and she looked exactly the way an air hostess was supposed to, like Marilyn Monroe on stilts, playing the part of a firm, friendly nurse with a naughty inner life. None of her passengers would have guessed she spent every flight half-fucked on champagne and orange juice, which she would down in the galley from takeoff to landing. By the time I rented a room from her in 1986 in a remote beach town on the north coast of Western Australia, she had retired. Her hair was short and brown. She never wore makeup or shaved her armpits, and she looked better than ever. But she was nearing 40, and our airline encouraged its hostesses to make a graceful exit by the age of 35. That was true in the 80s, by the way. Qantas made people quit by the time they were 35. Women quit.
Yes.
My own retirement made less sense. I was only 26, and anyway, being a man, I could have held on until at least 50. But I had believed all those handsy husbands in business class who, assuming I was gay, liked to tell me I was good looking enough to be on TV. So I left, not long after Jill did, to be on TV. When that didn't pan out, and I wanted to lick my wounds for a while, the only idea I had was to head northwest, to follow Jill to her feral little township, which was, by the way, chock full of retired flight attendants. Well, where else were we hosties going to go when we got too old, too tired, when our voices gave out from all those smoky flights? When we'd spent years in the air, crossing the Pacific, crossing the Nullarbor, half imagining that because time seems to slow during plane travel, the years weren't passing below us, killing our parents, burying our friends in marriages and the wrecks of marriages, driving up the price of city real estate. So that when we retired, the single place we could afford to live was a tropical town so remote you could justify flying there only if you had an ex-employee's airline discount. Mid-sized cruise ships stopped in all the time for the sunsets, the seafood platters, the Japanese cemetery, the quaint purling boats. But by car, the town was 22 hours from the nearest city. I'll jump ahead slightly. Jill met me at the airport. She was wearing white shorts and a pale pink blouse. Her face was bare and her hair was spiky. And the first thing she said was, "Recognize me without my glad rags?" I did, of course. Whatever she wore, she was unmistakable. I want to explain why and won't be able to, but here goes. She looked like luck. Jill had this open, mobile face and a megawatt smile, and there was an intense vitality to her, a kind of giving off of energy, like life was electric and she was at the very middle of it, even up there in that town on the shitty rim of nowhere. It was all irresistible. And what made it so irresistible was that while she hummed in the charged center of life, she also seemed relaxed, unbothered, like a goddess operating on a different timescale from everyone around her. She walked with a kind of serene shimmy. She never moved or spoke or smiled quickly. She let it all unfold with a slight reserve that felt luxurious because it seemed so unnecessary. I couldn't have said any of this back then when I walked into that airport, which was basically a shed in the middle of a paddock, and saw Jill waiting for me. I just thought she was the most desirable thing I'd ever seen. I wanted to sleep with her, obviously, who wouldn't? But I also felt, walking towards her, that my life would be better, easier for her proximity, that she'd always be able to tell me what to do, and she'd always be right. She had a disheveled dog with her sitting obediently at her feet, a standard poodle the color of toast.
So I have one more question and then I'm going to open it up to the floor. This is kind of a craft question. Your characters are so richly drawn, even the offstage minor characters, like that poodle who just showed up, well, what I was thinking of is a Sunita or Sunny's mother in Abroad, who's on the phone with Sunny, but even being channeled through like we never actually hear her voice. We just hear, or maybe one fragment of her voice, maybe we hear, but mostly we just have Sunny's report of what the mother is saying. So these far off stage characters are still so fully wrought. And I just wonder how you make decisions about bringing characters in, and how you can bring them in a way they're so fully formed, but don't like clutter up the story at all. Sorry.
No, no, no. It's okay. I mean, I feel as if that is exactly what I'm trying to do. So thank you. And I always think about that line in E.M. Forster's Aspects of the Novel when he talks about a character having been so fully gotten in is the phrase that he uses, that we understand exactly who or what he is. And the example he gives, I think, is that someone something chested and loved, or Somerset Maugham, or something. It's not even his, but he says something about a bald man whose hair had been red and who liked to go first through a doorway or something. There's some description that, and he has been gotten so thoroughly gotten in that is all we need to know about him, that he's the kind of man who is now bald, but you can tell he had red hair, and that he always likes to go first through a doorway. And that stuck with me, although I have quoted it very poorly just now, because of the fact that it got so quickly at the way this person is in motion and the way they kind of affect the weather around them. And it's not just about this is what he looked like, or this is an opinion he had, or this is one piece of his background. It's about the speed with which we see him enact his own personality in the world. And I think that has stayed with me. I'm not sure how conscious I am of that at all times, but I think that stood with me as a craft lesson that I found especially useful. And that when I am again panicking as I write, I can return to at any moment. How does this character walk through a doorway? And it's not that I'm going to use that as the example, but as long as I'm thinking about them in motion, then I find it more possible to feel that they are a presence that I can introduce into the story, rather than a character that I can kind of shoehorn into something more artificial.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. So we have about 20 minutes that we can I just have a conversation. So I invite questions, comments. Oh, there's a.
Oh, there's a mic. Hi. Thank you. It was really nice to hear it in your voice. I've been thinking that you must have needed something more than just a desire to deplatform the killer to really get you through the writing of this book without ever going there. Like how did you motivate that not caring?
I don't think I had to. I think I genuinely didn't care. But you know, I do think that was possible because the killer is based on a real situation. And even though I have taken pains to change the biography, the nature of the killings, that there was one man and that it was happening often to travelers who were hitchhiking on one highway, and that he buried their bodies in this one forest, exists already. And that's part of what the story is pushing against. So it's pushing against a vacancy that is in fact very full already, culturally, at least for an Australian reader. But I think for other readers as well, because we know serial killer stories, we know what that looks like. And we know how stories like that work. So this absence is in fact really, really present because the reader provides it. And it's just more specific. The one that an Australian reader or someone who's familiar with Ivan Milat, the killer that it's based on, provides that, but another reader just provides some other version of it. The US there's no shortage of highway killers in the late 20th century in the US either. So I think that's for the reader to do, and that's how I could not care. But not caring isn't the right word. It's not the right term, because I do care about what the reader feels or thinks or is bringing to it. What I mean is that I don't need to hear Ted Bundy talk about himself or Ivan Milat talk about himself. That's not what I want to hear from or about. And those character motivations, the curiosity that we have around them, which I have, which everyone has, is one of the things that I wanted to interrogate in the book. Because we do want to know these stories. We're obsessed by them. Many people are fascinated and drawn to them. And what does it mean to have that kind of curiosity? And so I wanted that curiosity to be present in the book without ever being really fulfilled.
Yeah, I think that the book struggles a lot with how we consume these stories and tries to chart some like insistence on an ethical base, like to engage in the lives of the world beyond the event. And there was this moment in the story Hostel where the narrator describes her desire to hear the attractive Roy recount this well-worn story about a brush with one of the victims. And it says, it felt as though this might be my last chance to get close to the largeness of life, its terror and mystery, while remaining perfectly safe. And I thought, I feel implicated in that, like because there is a natural like draw to it. But yeah, can you say a little bit more about this dynamic and this critique that the book makes? But also congratulations for winning the crime writers prize.
That was funny to suddenly get nominated for all these crime writing awards. And thinking if people picked this up as a crime novel, they would be quite disappointed, I think.
Like wanting a thrill from a place of perfect safety.
And I think that makes sense, and I feel that too. And I think the reader should feel uncomfortable about that, but that the book should feel uncomfortable. The book is absolutely complicit in that entire narrative movement toward, the curiosity and the fascination with it. So there's no way for this book to completely step aside from or extract itself from the sensationalism that it's critiquing. And that is part of what I hope is interesting about it, that there's no way to reproduce this even kind of tangentially or opaquely and not also participate in it. And that came home to me really strongly when I listened to there's an Australian audiobook and an American audiobook for various reasons. There are two. But listening to the American audiobook, they hired actors to do the podcast episode. And so I listened to it as if it was an actual podcast episode. That's what it's like in the audiobook. And something happens when it becomes the thing that it's critiquing. It participates in it in a new way and I felt a kind of complicated thrill about that and a complicated shame about it as well, that this is the thing that my book is talking about. And I hope that, I love true crime podcasts of the kind that I sort of parody a little here. I hope it's an affectionate sort of parodying, but that brought home to me, I think in a more visceral way, the ways in which the book can't help but participate in this particular sort of mode of fascination and morbid curiosity. It just can't do that. It can't avoid that. And I think that is why I appreciate how much like a book it feels when it's not being read aloud by actors, so that we're constantly being reminded that this is not a smooth, simple artifact in the world, that it's a report of a podcast rather than the podcast itself. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. Do we have more questions and comments?
Hi, thank you so very much for this. You're a fascinating writer, and this is a wonderful book. I guess my question could be described as a craft question, perhaps. Like, I'm really curious to think about how this desire to turn readers' attention or care towards something else besides just the morbid curiosity of Biga and the murders committed by him. It's also found in the very structure of the stories, not like the individual stories, but the way they're arranged in the collection. And I find a really good example of that, like the last handful of stories. Some of them are starting with Fat Suit, they're 2024, and then 2028, and then 2020, and then we go all the way back to 1950. And there's something about that rhythm of how time is managed in the collection that I find I think it's one of the most compelling aspects of the entire book. So I'm just curious to think about with you, like, how did you come up with that structure? Did you have alternate versions of like the arrangement of the stories? And how did you arrive at the final version of how the stories are arranged in the overall collection?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, that's a difficult thing. Even, I mean, my other collection of short stories is not connected in any way, and that was difficult to decide in what order that should be in. But this one felt particularly so. I outsourced this to my dearest friend, who is also my first reader, because I found myself unable to unknow the stories in order to think about the order they should be in. And she's really familiar with them as well, but there was something about her having not written the stories that made it possible for her to think about the release of information and what that should look like. But the one thing that we both agreed on from the beginning was that Lucy, the final story, had to go last. Because, I mean, that story's been published separately and it stands on its own as a story, but the end of it is very different if you read it as a self-contained story than if you read it coming at the end of this book. But I wanted that sense at the end that we're returning to the beginning of something. And here is a moment where if this hadn't happened, none of the rest of the book would have happened. And I wanted it to feel like a moment of horror and dread, but also of possibility, and also to feel sort of cyclical, and you know that we're not done with this yet. There's no end to it at all. So I knew that from the beginning, and then otherwise it was a lot of conversations about we've got a lot of first person stories in one chunk. We've got a lot of the more experimental, kind of formally experimental stories in one chunk. How do we spread them out? And then once I'd made a decision about the order in which the stories would go, then there were tweaks to make about how much do we reveal about Bega in this first story, and how do I delay that to later ones as well. So there was a lot of thought that went into it, but I'm very appreciative to my friend for doing a good bit of that thought for me.
Hello, is this on? Okay. First off, thank you. I have just a simple question, I guess. It seems like the process of like compiling these stories and like building this web of interconnected stories is very explorative or like imaginative in a sense. Was there a story maybe that or connection that surprised you, or maybe just seemed so improbable, but then as you worked on creating that connection to the central event just felt so right? I guess it just seems like it would be such an experience to work through this process, and I'm curious as to like what brought you joy.
Yeah, thank you. That's a lovely question. I think, well, the story I had most fun writing is the one that's entirely one sentence, where it's just the politician lamenting the fact that he has the same name. That was an incredible joy to write. I really enjoyed it. I wrote it mostly in one day, sitting in a garden in England, having a lovely time. But I think probably the hostess story that I just read from, because that was part of the challenge, listening to this extremely loud guy talking for 5 hours about his retirement as a flight attendant, and thinking about how I could use that and where that might come, how that might fit into the book. And I tried multiple different ways. So, you know, I sort of said that I kept trying to wait for it to happen. And there were periods where I really tried to force it and it wasn't working. And then when it did come to me, when the connection to Bega did come to me, it just felt so absolutely right. And that it is one of those moments that is so deeply satisfying and is why we keep doing what we do. And it's what I mean when I sort of talk about needing the process of writing to bring its own satisfactions with it. Because you have no idea if, you know, a crime award is going to decide that it should shortlist your novel, or you know, that other people will want to read it at all. But the satisfaction of feeling that piece click together and knowing that it was right because it wasn't forced and because it wasn't obvious, and that I had earned the place of my talkative retired flight attendant in the book. Yeah, that was very joyous. Yeah. Eucalypts, yeah.
Not eucalyptus.
Oh, well, a eucalyptus tree is a eucalypt. So you could say both. I know it's relevant to the Californian context because you have so many of them, but they're Australian.
I mean, I've been thinking a lot about the eucalyptus grove here
Hmm.
because they are working on a plan of potential removal of it.
Yeah.
And it's really scary because it's like such a core place here. Did you, like, how did you connect with the eucalyptus? Because it must have been huge for you.
Well, the eucalyptus is an Australian tree, and it's an invasive species here, and there are good reasons. I hate the death of any tree or the removal of any tree. I experience tree grief, really specific tree grief around tree removal. But but as is so often the case, when an when a species is transplanted from one place to another place it shouldn't be, and which makes eucalyptus in many ways a beautiful metaphor for colonialism and etc. But one of the things that happens is that it doesn't have the same, it's not in the same environment. It doesn't have the same, what's the word I'm looking for? Enemies is the word I'm looking for. Not the word I'm looking for, but it's what happened. So the eucalyptus here in California grows much larger than it does in Australia, and causes problems of all kinds. And there are good reasons to think about removing it, but there's still tree grief around it. But for me, I mean, I bought a house right next to a huge park full of eucalyptus trees because they are so important to me as an Australian, especially one who's lived overseas. I remember once as a grad student when I lived in England, I went on a trip to Spain because at the time Ryanair flights were 99p and it was cheaper to go to Spain than it was to go to London. And I remember just being in a park and encountering a eucalyptus tree and crushing the leaves in my hands so I could smell them and crying. And it was so eucalyptus trees are enormously important to any Australian. That sensory concrete detail that links us to home. But my relationship to them here is different because I am really conscious of the ways in which there is an ecosystem here that was not designed to support them. So I think it's a much more complicated question when you have it in a new context. Yeah.
Do we have one last question or comment? Yes.
I have a quick question about genre, because I think that, it's sort of beat into our heads as English students here that engaging in genre fiction is somehow not a good thing, and that the conventions of it sort of obscure your own writing. And clearly that's not happening with this book. Clearly this is a very like literary and beautiful and complex book. But were there any moments that you sort of found yourself fighting it? Like, and you were saying too that like you got nominated for all these crime awards, and people sort of just by reading the summary would assume that it is a crime book. Were there moments in reading this that you found yourself sort of fighting against genre conventions, or did you feel that sort of in commenting on them and working outside of them, it was sort of a joyful literary experience in spite of it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that literary fiction is a genre, and that's a genre that I'm working in that brings its own conventions along with it. So I want to avoid a sense in which literary fiction stands as some kind of neutral non-category. One of the joys of literary fiction is that we get to steal from other genres in all the ways that we want to, and we get to be in conversation with them. I think that any book is successful that fulfills what it sets out to do. So I think genre fiction can be incredibly satisfying to both write and to read. All of that is to say that this is definitely not a crime book. It is if we understand a book in the crime genre to be about something, about a specific narrative movement, which is that a crime takes place and it is investigated and then solved. It is not that. And there are questions there around as soon as you change the conventions of a book within one genre, it's no longer in that genre. How useful does the term genre even become? It's not crime in that sense, but it's also not crime in that sense. I think that questions around genre are more interesting to English professors maybe, but certainly to marketing departments of publishing houses than they are to writers. And so if I had felt the book was taking me in a crime genre direction, I would have been willing to follow it there and see what happened. And if it didn't, then that's fine too. But I think engaging with genre is just a way of engaging with storytelling and what it is and can be. So there are certainly some stories in here that are much more like crime stories than others. Yeah, that was quite a vague answer to a question. The question, I suppose what I would say is that as a writer, I'm not bothered. Yeah. So.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Fiona, for this amazing conversation and for sharing this book. And yes, grab 5 copies. All your holiday gifts.